Since the dawn of time, we have searched for our own reflection through the glass of kings and queens to the digital mirrors of today.
One dark night, a family lay awake listening to footsteps outside their home. There was no bolt on the door, no bar across the frame, nothing but a woven reed mat hanging in the doorway and the thin hope that whoever was outside would simply keep walking. Sleep, for most of human history, was not the relaxed unconsciousness people take for granted today. It was a nightly gamble, taken in a home that could be entered by anyone strong enough to push through a curtain or lift a piece of hide out of its frame. Today, the average front door in the United States, Britain, Canada, or Australia has at least one deadbolt, often a second chain lock, sometimes a smart lock that recognizes a fingerprint or a phone. People fall asleep within minutes of getting into bed, rarely giving a second thought to the 6 millimeters of hardened steel standing between them and the outside world. This confidence is so complete that most people would struggle to remember the last time they consciously worried about someone simply walking into their bedroom while they slept. So how did people get from a reed mat to a deadbolt? How did anyone sleep peacefully for thousands of years before a reliable lock existed? And what happened the first time someone built a device that could actually stop an intruder rather than merely slow one down? The story involves an Egyptian carpenter's trick, a Roman jewelry obsession, a locksmith's public challenge with a fortune attached to it, and a burglary so brazen it terrified an entire nation into rethinking security. The answer is far stranger than most people imagine. The earliest known lock in human history was not made of metal at all. Archaeologists have traced the pin tumbler concept back roughly 4,000 years to ancient Egypt, where carpenters built a wooden device consisting of a large bolt that slid through a slot cut into the door and its frame. Above the bolt sat a wooden housing filled with a set of loose wooden pins, each one dropping under gravity into matching holes drilled through the bolt itself the moment the door was closed, locking it firmly in place until the correct wooden key was inserted to lift each pin back out of the way. This device, often called the Egyptian lock, was crude by modern standards, but it represented something genuinely new in human history. For the first time, a household did not have to rely purely on physical strength, a loyal guard dog, or a family member staying awake through the night to keep intruders out. The lock did the work automatically, using nothing but gravity and a carefully carved key that might be 1.5 feet long, since Egyptian keys of this era were often large enough to be carried openly over the shoulder rather than hidden in a pocket. Similar wooden pin locks appeared independently in ancient Assyria and Babylon, discovered by archaeologists working at sites near the ancient city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. Yet even at their best, these early wooden locks solved only part of the problem people faced at night. Wood could be split with an axe, door frames could be pried apart with a simple lever. The lock kept out casual intruders and curious neighbors, but it offered almost no protection against anyone determined enough to bring a tool and enough time to use it. Ancient Greece and Rome pushed the lock forward by finally introducing metal into the equation. Greek locksmiths developed iron locks operated by large, curved keys inserted through a hole in the door and turned to move a bolt on the inside, a design that required no direct line of sight to the mechanism and could therefore be operated from outside a locked room. Roman engineers refined this further, producing smaller, more precise iron and bronze locks fitted with wards, which were metal obstructions inside the lock designed to block any key except one cut with the exact matching pattern of notches. Roman society also transformed the key itself into something far more personal than a practical tool. Wealthy Roman citizens began wearing small bronze or iron keys on rings, worn openly on the finger as a visible symbol that a person owned property valuable enough to lock away. Roman writers described this practice explicitly, noting that a key ring signaled a household with jewelry, coin, or fine cloth worth protecting, turning an object meant for security into a public display of wealth and status that anyone passing on the street could immediately recognize. But that public display created a problem the Romans never fully solved. A key worn on the hand told potential thieves exactly who in a neighborhood had something worth stealing, effectively advertising which homes deserved the most attention after dark. Roman locks, for all their cleverness, remained vulnerable to a skilled thief carrying a set of hooks and thin metal picks, since the ward system that blocked incorrect keys could often be defeated simply by working a thin tool around the obstruction rather than needing an exact key at all. The lock had become more sophisticated, it had not yet become trustworthy. For centuries, the greatest weakness of every lock built in the ancient and early medieval world was not the mechanism itself, but the false sense of security it created. A homeowner who installed an iron-warded lock on their door genuinely believed their family was safe, unaware that professional thieves across Rome and later across medieval Europe had developed simple techniques for defeating exactly this style of lock. This meant that for well over 1,000 years, people were sleeping soundly behind locks that offered barely more real protection than the wooden bolts they had replaced, the only difference being that the new lock owners no longer felt the fear that might have kept them appropriately cautious. Ironically, the very people responsible for building these locks were often the same people capable of defeating them. Blacksmiths, who held a monopoly on the specialized knowledge required to forge a functioning lock, also understood every weakness built into their own designs, and medieval guild records occasionally describe locksmiths being called upon by wealthy clients specifically because a rival locksmith's product had been picked. This created a strange, self-reinforcing industry, where the same craft responsible for security also quietly guaranteed that no lock could ever be considered truly safe from someone who understood how locks worked. Yet something even stranger developed alongside this vulnerability. Because true security was so difficult to guarantee, wealthy households throughout the medieval period increasingly relied on visible intimidation rather than mechanical strength. Massive iron locks, some weighing several pounds and covering nearly the entire surface of a door, became common not because their internal mechanisms were more secure, but because their sheer size and elaborate decoration were meant to discourage an intruder before they ever tried the mechanism at all. A lock, in other words, had become as much theater as technology, a warning sign built to look unbeatable whether or not it actually was. Castles and fortified manor houses across medieval Europe relied on a combination of massive wooden doors reinforced with iron strapping, heavy drawbars set into brackets on the inside, and elaborate locks built by master blacksmiths who guarded their techniques as closely as any guild secret. The wealthiest households commissioned locks disguised as decorative objects, hiding the keyhole behind a sliding metal panel shaped like a flower or a coat of arms, forcing an intruder to first locate the mechanism before even attempting to defeat it. These disguised locks represented some of the most advanced security engineering available anywhere in the world at the time. For the ordinary medieval family, however, none of this applied. A peasant's home, typically a single-room structure made of timber, wattle, and thatch, rarely had a door strong enough to justify an iron lock at all, and most families relied instead on a simple wooden bar dropped into brackets on the inside of the door each night. Security, for the vast majority of the medieval population, meant staying inside a small, tightly knit village where neighbors would notice a stranger immediately, rather than trusting in any mechanical device to protect them individually. But that wasn't the biggest problem facing medieval security. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and anyone sleeping outside the protection of a walled town faced nights with no locked door at all, often relying on shared inns where a traveler's only protection was a wooden latch that any determined guest in the building could lift from outside with a simple tool slipped through the gap beneath the door. Robbery of sleeping travelers was common enough that many medieval towns passed laws requiring innkeepers to lock outer gates after dark, shifting responsibility for nighttime safety away from the individual traveler and onto the community managing the building as a whole. By the late 18th century, growing wealth and property crime in rapidly expanding cities like London had turned lock security into an urgent public concern rather than a private luxury. In 1784, a locksmith named Joseph Bramah unveiled a radically new lock design using a set of sliding metal discs, each notched to a slightly different depth, arranged so precisely that only one uniquely cut key could rotate all of them into the exact alignment needed to release the bolt. Bramah was so confident in his invention that he displayed it publicly in his London shop window with a sign challenging anyone in the world to pick it open, offering a substantial cash reward to whoever succeeded. That challenge remained unanswered for an astonishing 67 years, standing as one of the longest-running public dares in the history of engineering, until an American locksmith named Alfred D. Charles Hobbs finally defeated the Bramah lock in 1851, after working on it for weeks at the Great Exhibition in London, using specially built tools he had brought specifically for the attempt. The event became international news, embarrassing British lock manufacturers, and triggering a wave of renewed investment into lock design across Europe, since a device once considered mathematically unbeatable had just been publicly humiliated in front of thousands of exhibition visitors. Meanwhile, a separate breakthrough had already reshaped the industry decades earlier under far more dramatic circumstances. In 1817, thieves broke into the Portsmouth dockyard in England and stole a significant quantity of naval supplies despite the presence of locks that were assumed to be secure, a burglary embarrassing enough that the British government launched a public competition for a lock capable of detecting tampering. A locksmith named Jeremiah Chubb responded in 1818 with a design that not only resisted picking far more effectively than earlier locks, but included a hidden mechanism that would visibly jam and reveal to the owner that someone had attempted to break in, turning the lock itself into a witness against any failed intrusion. Without realizing it, Bramah, Hobbs, and Chubb had collectively triggered an arms race between lock makers and lock breakers that has never truly ended, establishing a pattern that would define the entire security industry for the next 2 centuries. Every improvement in locking technology invited a corresponding improvement in the tools and techniques used to defeat it, meaning true security was never a fixed achievement but an ongoing contest, one that depended as much on staying ahead of criminal ingenuity as it did on clever engineering in a workshop. The lock that finally brought reliable, affordable security into ordinary homes emerged in the United States rather than Britain. In 1848, an American inventor named Linus Yale Sr. patented a pin tumbler lock inspired directly by the ancient Egyptian design, using small metal pins of varying lengths that had to be lifted to precisely the correct height by a serrated key before the lock cylinder would rotate. His son, Linus Yale Jr., refined the design further in 1861, shrinking the mechanism down to a size small enough to fit inside an ordinary residential doorknob and creating the small, flat, serrated key shape that remains instantly recognizable on keyrings around the world today. This changed everything for the average household. Unlike earlier warded locks, which could often be defeated with a simple hook-shaped tool, the pin tumbler mechanism required genuine skill and specialized tools to pick, making it far more resistant to casual burglary while remaining cheap enough for factories to mass produce by the thousands. For the first time in human history, an ordinary working family, not just wealthy merchants or nobility, could afford a lock that provided meaningful protection rather than mere symbolic reassurance. Mass production accelerated further after Harry Soref founded the Master Lock Company in 1921, introducing an affordable laminated steel padlock built from stacked layers of metal that made the lock's internal mechanism dramatically harder to drill or pry open than earlier cast designs. Soref reportedly demonstrated his lock's durability by firing a bullet directly into it during a public promotional event, and the lock held. Within a few decades, laminated padlocks and pin tumbler door locks had become standard equipment in homes, schools, factories, and businesses across the entire industrialized world. The sudden availability of genuinely reliable locks did more than protect property. It quietly reshaped how people related to their own sense of safety at night. Historians studying urban life in the late 19th century have noted that as pin tumbler locks became standard in city apartments and townhouses, insurance companies began adjusting premiums based on what type of lock a building used, effectively assigning a financial value to a family's sense of overnight security for the first time. A good lock no longer just kept a person calm. It could now lower the cost of protecting everything they owned. This new reliability also created an unexpected demand for people capable of defeating it. As pin tumbler and laminated padlocks became widespread, a specialized criminal skill set in lock-picking grew alongside it, eventually splitting into two very different professions occupying the same technical knowledge. Locksmiths hired to help people locked out of their own homes and burglars hired by no one but themselves both relied on nearly identical tools and techniques, meaning the very expertise required to protect a home was the same expertise required to break into one. No one expected what happened next as the rise of reliable locks began shifting the psychology of crime itself. Burglary statistics across industrialized cities in the early 20th century show a measurable shift away from forced entry through doors and toward alternative points of access such as unlocked windows, back entrances, or simple deception to get a resident to open the door voluntarily. The lock had become strong enough that criminals increasingly stopped attacking it directly, instead searching for the weakest point in an entire household's security rather than the strongest one, a strategic shift that remains true of burglary patterns to this day. Today, the pin tumbler lock designed by the Yale family still forms the mechanical basis of the majority of residential locks used across the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia more than a century and a half after its invention. Yet an entirely new layer of security has begun to grow around it. Smart locks, connected to home internet networks and controlled through smartphone apps, now allow homeowners to lock or unlock a door remotely, receive alerts the instant someone enters, and grant temporary digital keys to guests or delivery workers without ever cutting a physical copy. Biometric locks, using fingerprints or facial recognition rather than any physical key at all, have moved from science fiction into ordinary hardware stores within the span of a single generation, echoing the same underlying human desire that first drove Egyptian carpenters to carve wooden pins into a door bolt 4,000 years earlier. The technology looks entirely unrecognizable compared to ancient Egypt or Rome, yet the core problem it solves has never changed even slightly, allowing a person to sleep, work, and live without needing to personally stand guard over every entrance to their own home. Meanwhile, the same arms race that began with Joseph Bramah's public challenge in 1784 continues today in digital form, as cybersecurity researchers regularly demonstrate vulnerabilities in smart locks that can sometimes be defeated with signal jamming devices or software exploits rather than any physical tool at all. The lock has changed its shape from wood to iron to steel to silicon, but the underlying contest between those building security and those determined to defeat it remains exactly as active now as it was in a Roman blacksmith's workshop 2,000 years ago. The family, lying awake behind a reed mat listening to footsteps in the dark, had no way of knowing that their fear would eventually be answered by 4,000 years of quiet, accumulating human effort. Egyptian carpenters carving wooden pins, Roman blacksmiths forging iron wards, medieval craftsmen hiding keyholes behind decorative panels, a locksmith's public challenge that stood unbeaten for 67 years, and a father and son in 19th-century America shrinking an ancient idea down to fit inside an ordinary doorknob all led eventually to a door that a person could close at night and trust. The next time you turn a small brass key or press a thumb against a glowing panel beside your front door, it may be worth remembering what that quiet click actually represents. It is not simply metal moving against metal. It is the end result of a fear that kept humans awake for most of recorded history, finally answered by generation after generation of builders who refused to accept that safety at night should depend on luck alone. For thousands of years, a peaceful night's sleep was never guaranteed. Now, for most people reading this, it is simply something they forget to be grateful for.